All right. Thank you for being willing to participate in this today for my communications class.
Absolutely.
So to start, please tell me just a little bit about your role, who you are, and just kind of what your day-to-day looks like in your field.
Okay. So I work for the Washington State Department of Health. I am within their Environmental Public Health Science Division, specifically working for two different smaller offshoot sections. One of them deals with pesticide illness, the other deals with childhood lead poisoning prevention, and I serve as their policy analyst. So while I don't have a perfect description of a day-to-day aside from attending a lot of meetings, my work currently is focusing a lot on drafting communications to partners that will be published and distributed to healthcare providers and reporters of blood lead test results to inform them of upcoming policy recommendations.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
How did you get your start in that field?
So, my interest, this is all due to my interest in childhood lead poisoning prevention, which began as the result of an internship I had my first year of college. I went to George Mason University, but I was originally from upstate New York, and I got connected up with a Legal Services of Central New York internship in the city of Syracuse, New York, and I was one of their first ever non-law school student interns, which was neat, and it meant that I, myself and an internship partner, did two things focusing on housing. First, we attended landlord-tenant court each day and court watched and reported on case outcomes. And then we also, in the afternoon, canvassed a lot of the disempowered and marginalized neighborhoods in Syracuse to talk with them about childhood lead poisoning prevention. And after that, it just became it was kind of just more of a convenient academic interest, and then it became into more of a passion that resulted in, more internships focusing on the topic and doing my own master's thesis on lead poisoning prevention policy, which in a roundabout way led me to this job because I was subscribed to the LeadNet listserv, which connects lead poisoning prevention professionals throughout the world, but primarily in the U.S., to share job postings, news, articles, discussions, practical questions, all that kind of stuff. And this job was posted in there. I applied and I got it.
Okay. So that's what brought you to Spokane specifically?
Yes, I was, since it's a state position and it's all really home-based following the pandemic, I was able to live anywhere in the state, and I chose Spokane.
Mm-hmm. Have you noticed any big differences between the health systems where you're from and the health system here? I
would say yes. Let's see. Because I think about North Carolina, which is where I went to grad school, and I would say one defining factor of their health system compared to here is that they have everything primarily centralized. So primary authority, at least for dealing with lead poisoning prevention, was with the State Department of Health and Human Services, whereas in Washington, we are more local jurisdictions where Department of Health can provide guidance and support to local health, but local health are the ones with the authority to do all the response. Mm-hmm. And I think having that approach in North Carolina was beneficial in that they were the state responsible for identifying the applesauce that was contaminated with lead a few years back, because you had the same folks at the Department of Health working on these cases where they couldn't identify the source of lead, but one common factor between them was that the kids really loved this one cinnamon applesauce from Dollar Tree. So yeah, I think it had a lot of benefits in that way of just having some more of the knowledge to maybe be a little bit more effective, because right now it's we have 35 health jurisdictions, and the folks there are working on almost every notifiable condition. So
In the country or in the state? We have
in the
35.
state. In the state, we have 35 local health jurisdictions, and so what that often means is that lead is very unlikely to be one of their top priorities, and you'll have staff members at these county jurisdictions that are, like 80% of their day might be dealing with like a syphilis outbreak that is happening in their county, or other notifiable conditions, which could also include foodborne illness, because local is also responsible for a lot of the food safety. So it does mean that at the end of the day, some local lead cases may end up being neglected just due to limited staff capacity, whereas there can be like a more effective use of specialization or whatever at a more top-down system.
How big is the team that you work with?
So in total, I think we have like 27 or so people across a bunch of different things. So I think there's like 4 or 5 people on the pesticide illness team, and we have a couple data people that support pesticide illness and the lead program. We also have lead in school drinking water, which has like 4 or 5 folks that are just hired throughout the year to do lead sampling at schools throughout the state. Then we have like the epidemiology and surveillance folks, and we have the childhood lead prevention and response team, which is the primary team that I work with. But I'm sort of on my own in terms of the leadership structure. Like, I don't have anyone working under me, but I'm part of all of them.
And since you're fully remote, how do you feel that works for your communication style? With this class specifically, we go over a lot of, it's a communication class, so we go over a lot of like digital versus in person. How does that kind of compare to the times that you've been in person versus how do you feel like your team works through these more, like, I know you do Zoom and calls and things like that?
Yeah. I would say that something I noticed for both when I was doing grad school online and doing work here online is that you don't get the same kind of impromptu connections and conversations and general awareness of like everyone who works in the Department of Health. You don't get as many of those more spontaneous conversations that can lead to a lot of learning and connections and problem solving. Things, unfortunately, are a lot more formal. Can't have a conversation where you're just like walking over to that person's cubicle and just chatting for a bit. It has to be over a Teams message, or sometimes you have someone messaging you really quick that's just like, hey, can I call you really quick for a second? And while a lot of times that whole thing is just like super non-emergent, whatever they need to call for, that I've heard has prompted a lot of anxiety and worry, especially now that we're in a time of like essentially tightened resources. So some folks are definitely scared that like the, hey, can I talk to you for a second over Teams could mean a bigger conversation that results in them being laid off or bumped. Whereas if you were just saying it in person, it would be pretty immediate that you could then get to the point and there wouldn't be any of that pre-discussion worry. So yeah, and then there's also just definitely been a lot of issues that have come up here and there where it's like the limitations of communication over email or Teams messages has resulted in conversations being a lot more protracted than they would need to be until you can actually all like get into a call and talk about specifically whatever it is. There's definitely things that are just not easy to explain when typing out. So that's also been a challenge, and given that I live on the other side of the state from most of my coworkers, because they all live around Tumwater, Olympia area, that has also been an interesting divide because there's a lot of there's a lot more engagement and focus on, having special in-person days, but those special in-person days where it could be, where like the Office of Drinking Water comes in and they show you how to do like chlorine testing in your water or whatever, like those kinds of cross-department educational things and talking with people, that really only happens at the Olympia campus because so few people from the department live out here. So that's another downside.
I totally get that. At my work, we have quite a few offices based out of the Seattle area, and so we'll get on these Zoom calls where they're all in person in Seattle, but we're all over here. So you talked a little bit about just like the tightening of resources and other things like that affecting just how staff works together and what you're able to get done. Is that due to things like the government funding changes, or can you go into a little bit about how that's affected you and your work? One of the other people I was interviewing, or was going to interview, is in the nonprofit sphere, and so they had similar struggles with funding from that.
Yeah. So we already started off this year in a pretty tough spot with just the state government shortfalls of anticipating huge cuts in the sales tax revenue. So that was already putting us in a bad spot of needing to do a lot of reorganization of different departments, getting rid of positions, eliminating positions, closing vacant positions, even if that position, really needed to be filled. So then you also had a lot of internal turmoil because some staff that were higher up that got laid off, they were part of the union, and the collective bargaining agreement allows for bumping rights, so they could bump someone else out of their position if they qualified for that job. So it was like a cascading effect, and it took a long time to figure out whether or not someone was like at risk or not. There wasn't really any clear communication about that in advance. So that led to a lot of worries and frustrations and fears, and just like, we were working on a project that we have been working on since January that has rollout in February 2026. It's like, while we were planning for that in the early days, we would talk about like, okay, this needs to happen in November, but then of course the follow-up question would be, do we even know if any of us are going to be here in November? So that was a big thing. And then with my program in particular, were funded in part by CDC grant for the lead poisoning prevention program, and that entire department got laid off. It took a lot of political uproar to bring those folks back, but then they had to be onboarded again, and so then it wasn't until like pretty much the last moment that we ever learned that we did in fact get our CDC grant renewed. And if we hadn't gotten that, it would have led to layoffs, including most likely my own position.
I'm glad that didn't happen.
Me too.
So you touched a little bit on some of the projects you were working on at the start, but could you go into a little bit what specific projects you're working on right now?
Sure. So let's see, I'll start with the smallest one that's going to really be building up for hopefully the 2027 legislative session.
Recently done ones too if you want. Either one.
Yeah. This one essentially deals with some issues that we've noticed in implementing the lead in school drinking water law, which requires the Department of Health to go out and sample every single fixture in every single public school in the state that meets certain criteria. And there have been a lot of vague language in the way that the law was written that we're realizing now are causing a lot of procedural issues and are not serving our customers the best. So we are preparing for all of the pre-work to try and get agency request legislation, which would require the entirety of DOH, especially executive leadership, to really push for this change to occur, to get a legislative sponsor on this issue, and to move it into a legislative session, into a bill, and have it like move throughout the chambers. And so that requires a lot of political capital and people being interested and thinking that it's an important issue. So we're now sort of in the stage of planning how we can get folks on board with this being an important issue that political capital should be used on. And then the main one that has been taking up most of my work time is we are changing the point at which DOH recommends action take place following a child who has a blood lead test and has lead in their blood, changing what threshold value we recommend action occurring. So it used to be 5, we're now moving to 3.5 to align with CDC guidance and to be more protective of kids, because even low levels of lead are known to cause harm. So we're doing a lot of work around that, trying to anticipate all of the different questions that'll come up, who we need to communicate to. We're involved across a bunch of different sectors, so having to work with healthcare provider organizations, having to work with systems for just receiving cases, having to work with local health jurisdictions directly, and then also working with other distribution networks to get out the communications. So it's been a lot of planning and a lot of engagement with all of our partners.
Mm-hmm. Do you partner specifically with government agencies, or do you have like charitable organizations or local health groups that you work with at all?
So we do have, we have 2 different areas of engagement that we really work through right now. One of them is the Foundational Public Health Services led core team, which is composed entirely out of local health jurisdiction staff. But then we also have the Childhood Lead Advisory Committee, and that one has a far more broader membership, including some smaller organizations and community-based organizations like Mother Africa and the Afghan Health Initiative are some partners that we've worked with through this space. Primarily a lot of our focus is with the local health jurisdictions who are doing the work, but we also, work and talk with like labor and industries and the healthcare authority who does Medicaid and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned the Afghan Health Initiative and that you work with them a little bit. Part of what we've talked about in this class is just working with communities of different cultures and how communication expectations are not necessarily the same between different cultures. What things have you found, or I guess let me rephrase, how have you found the most effective to communicate the messages that you need to in communities that might not understand what you're trying to say, or that the message you're trying to impart that something they might be doing is harmful? How do you get that across effectively?
Yes. So there is a great example of how we've been able to do this work, and it has happened in Spokane actually, which is super cool. So to start, there was a study done by Public Health Seattle King County that identified for why like a bunch of recent arrivals from Afghanistan, both adults and kids, a lot of them had really high lead in their blood, and it was difficult to figure out where that was coming from. But then after doing a study, they learned that a lot of the cook pots that are either imported from Afghanistan or that folks brought with them, a lot of them contain a lot of impure metals that would leach into the food. And so there was a big initiative that was done in partnership with Department of Ecology and International Rescue Committee in Spokane to meet and engage with Afghan families and give them and have an exchange of their leaded pressure cookers with new lead-free ones. And a lot of that work was done directly through the International Rescue Committee, who has been heavily involved in resettling these populations and helping with paperwork, connections, all of those bits. And so they were, they had folks on their staff that could speak Dari and Pashto, the main languages of Afghanistan, and be able to communicate with those folks directly, and also develop new materials that were that could target an audience that may also have some limited literacy or reading skills, so we weren't having to rely on getting something across in like a big, dense English publication, but instead having direct community interface. We're hosting a cooking class to show them how to use their new pressure cookers, and the entire thing was led by a young woman out here who speaks, can't remember if during it she spoke Dari or Pashto, but she spoke one of those languages while leading them through cooking and using the pots on a traditional Afghan meal. So it seems like the best way to really engage with the population that you want to work with is to find groups that have already made some of those inroads and see how you can come to like a co-creation space or support the work they're doing without you trying to take the lead with all of your own assumptions about who you're working with.
Mm-hmm. As a government representative in some capacity, have you found with kind of the recent changes in federal legislation around immigration law that these communities are less likely to trust you or to allow you to come into their space, or is that something you haven't dealt with very much?
So I haven't personally dealt with that, but I know that what I've heard from some folks at local health jurisdictions who are trying to do this outreach is that it is often difficult to get some of these families to pick up their phone because getting a call from the government is almost never a good thing. Mm-hmm. And so that has been something that has been a consistent challenge of like, how can we make sure that this family brings their kid back in for another lead test, or how can we have this conversation to talk with them about where they might be exposed to lead? How can that happen when you have a lot of fear around any sort of government contact? So I don't think that I don't have a very good answer off the top of my head, but I know that it's definitely been brewing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we run into similar with populations who everyone, I work in obviously the financial services industry where everyone to some extent needs banking and needs financial services, and so we have people coming in of like, how do I make sure that the government doesn't just decide to seize my bank accounts because I'm from X, Y, and Z country, or how do I make sure that this, that, and the other doesn't happen? And we have definitely found that being able to place them with our associates who are fluent in Spanish or fluent in Russian, even though we have access to translation services, makes them feel more comfortable. Mm-hmm. So I can definitely empathize with that. So if you could go back to the beginning of your career with the knowledge that you've gained, is there anything that you might do differently?
That's one of those really hard questions because everything feels like it is a pivotal point where if I changed that, I don't know if I would have ended up on this same trajectory. Because obviously one of the first things I think of is that where I went to undergrad, George Mason University, it didn't have any kind of urban planning degree program, which is what my interest had become. And so the education there wasn't really serving me as well, but I met a professor there who I formed pretty deep ties with, who managed to provide me with some of the GIS and intro to urban planning knowledge that was fundamental for me to then get into grad school. So with all of those big decisions, it's really hard to see anything that I could have done differently that I know would have worked. Because, like, of course, there is the fact that I also got accepted into Columbia University for this dual program for grad school. So I could have ended up at Columbia instead, but when I think about that, even though there's the obvious benefit of having one of the foremost lead poisoning prevention policy experts at that school, I would have also not had any financial aid. I would have been just so drowning in debt by going to Columbia without any sort of support that it's hard to imagine that the benefits would have outweighed the disadvantages.
Mm-hmm. Which, this is less career-related and more school-related, but yeah. The teacher for this class specifically has talked to us a few times about keeping our work or keeping some of our videos, things like that, for if any of us decide to go to grad school. What considerations did you have in deciding whether or not you wanted to go to grad school, or what made your specific grad school right for you?
So I guess the first thing is that what really made me learn that I needed to go to grad school was that when I was thinking of going more directly into the city planning field, that you pretty much cannot get a job in that field unless you have a master's degree in planning. Even if you have it for undergrad, you still often need a master's degree to get into any position that will pay enough to support the work that you're doing. So that one was kind of already out of my hands for deciding. I mean, at the time, I was also thinking about law school, which also, of course, would have been another 3-year ordeal. But I think that when I did decide, part of what really helped for University of North Carolina was that they had the dual master's program that I wanted to go into, which was city planning and public health. And I do think that there were many ways that this program did not exactly work for me as much as it could have. One of those being like I had to get sort of a last minute advisor replacement for my master's thesis. And she wasn't very well versed in policy analysis or the work that I was doing. So I think ultimately it wasn't maybe the best match, or I wasn't able to like sort of form some of those some more of those advantageous conversations. Mm-hmm. But it's also like it still got me to where I am, so I can't harsh on it too much.
Well, and I had asked like, if you could go back to the beginning of your career, but I guess, I mean, you've been in this for a little while and been involved in this work, but you are relatively new to just being in this career field in Spokane specifically. What long-term goals are you still looking to achieve in this industry?
I don't know. I think that I would like to continue working in lead poisoning prevention. I think one thing I would definitely benefit from at some point is if I can do it from the local level, or if I can get involved on more of the case management side, which would actually be some of the interviewing and following up with families or following up with local health jurisdictions. I think that would be really valuable. But aside from that, it's hard to say any specific long-term goal. I guess one that has always been sort of there is like eventually I would love to work for the CDC lead branch. But that is something that just, it would require most likely uprooting my entire life and going all the way down to Georgia. And given the state of things, I don't think I want to do that. So
you just moved across the country.
Yeah, move across the country again in just a couple of years.
Right.
So I think for right now, being able to stay put for as long as I can in this job is my biggest long-term goal.
Is there upward mobility available to you, or is it kind of all on one tier where you are?
So there could always be potentially me ending up in a supervisory position where I do actually have people working under me. That is very unlikely given current financial situation. But that bit is always a possibility. Unless I became the entire program manager or section manager, there's not much that I can go from this position to go upwards. So I don't think that would end up turning out in my favor anytime soon, but I guess there's also always the possibility that I end up in just a more general policy role for the rest of environmental public health, and get to really learn more about a bunch of other different things and not just my one niche.
Special interest?
Yes.
Do you have a desire to step into a leadership role, or are you happy being an individual contributor for the time being, at least?
For the time being, I don't mind being an individual contributor. I think that there's also so much that I do not know and understand about how bureaucracy works and the hidden language of government that I don't think I would want to step into that anytime soon. I joked about it with another coworker that I would probably know so little that I would stumble into misconduct. So,
is it the Dilbert principle where it's like you're failing upward or you're promoted to your ability?
Oh.
But yeah. Is there anything, or I guess, what thoughts do you maybe have on the future of the industry that you're in? Are we seeing positive changes in childhood lead prevention, or are things kind of backsliding right now just with some of the backlash on public health?
The backlash from public health is definitely onto public health generally is definitely causing a lot of ripple effects that I think that are definitely not fully realized yet, but will have painful recovery periods following this. It's like generally there has been a lot of progress in working towards the elimination of childhood lead poisoning, but I also think that a lot of the imagination for solutions is unfortunately very constrained within current practicality. So, it's kind of a not great system to essentially not do anything about lead in a child's environment until a child has already been lead poisoned, because that can cause permanent damage. So it would be far better if we were going into all of the different rental properties and testing them for lead and requiring remediation. But that is an issue that faces up against a lot of just refusal, because it would mean more money that the property owners would have to spend. It would also mean, a quote-unquote violation of private property rights and so on. So it's hard to see exactly where we could go. I think right now just getting more kids tested is the least we can do. And Washington is still, we're climbing up, but we are not doing very well. So still very low.
You find that it's difficult kind of to show the public the economic value of prevention as opposed to a cure?
Yeah.
Or a fix?
Yeah, because it's one of those things where it's like, ultimately, if no children are, like, if lead poisoning is eliminated, it's going to be something that comes with a lot of upfront costs and a lot of more invisible, longer-term benefits. So it doesn't immediately translate to someone, oh, this person, didn't end up with something like kidney cancer or whatever, because of their very acute lead exposure. Those things can't be seen, and so that, I think, is another challenge with public health, is that, the best outcome for public health is that nothing happens, which then means that there is often a feeling that, oh, then we don't need this anymore. And then that can sort of contribute to then making the problem worse once more. So it's like it is getting better, but it is extremely difficult to justify to all of the people in power that this massive expenditure and potential lawsuit waiting to happen is worth doing.
Absolutely. This is pretty much what I had, but is there anything that I didn't ask you that you wish I would have, or anything that you maybe wanted to talk about that didn't necessarily come up?
I thought about something funny, but it would require you having to cut the video, so I won't say it.
Okay, perfect. Well, I appreciate you being willing to participate, and I'll get you the evaluation and all of that.